A manager stops opening the sales dashboard the week the numbers start slipping, not because they're busy, because looking feels worse than not looking. That single habit, repeated across thousands of managers in thousands of companies, has a name, and once you learn it, you'll start spotting it in your own calendar within a day. It's called the Ostrich Effect, named after the old myth that ostriches bury their heads in sand to avoid danger. Ostriches don't actually do that, it's a folk story. Not biology, but people absolutely do the workplace version of it, and they do it constantly, without ever consciously deciding to. Researchers studying investors found something almost comically consistent. People check their portfolio performance far less often during market downturns than during upswings. Even though a downturn is exactly the moment when information is most useful, when a decision might actually need to be made. And then, like clockwork, the same investors log back in the moment prices start climbing again. Nobody schedules this behavior. Nobody sits down and decides, deliberately, to stop checking bad news and start checking good news. It just happens, quietly, as an emotional reflex, dressed up as forgetfulness or busyness. The mechanism behind it is worth slowing down on because it explains why this shows up in management just as reliably as it shows up in investing. Checking a number isn't a neutral act. It's an act that carries emotional weight, because the number might confirm something you don't want confirmed. When performance is good, checking is basically free. You open the dashboard, you feel good, you close the dashboard. There's no downside to looking. But when performance might be bad, checking carries a cost before you've even seen the result. You might see something that forces you to feel worse, to admit a mistake, to have an uncomfortable conversation you'd rather not have. So the brain does something quietly rational in the short term and quietly disastrous in the long term. It avoids the input in order to avoid the feeling. Not looking isn't laziness. It's a trading information for a few more days of not having to feel the discomfort that information would bring. The workplace version of this shows up in more places than most managers would admit if you ask them directly. Teams stop reviewing churn numbers during a bad quarter because the number's probably going to be bad, and looking at it doesn't feel like it changes anything, except the manager's mood. Founders delay opening the burn rate spreadsheet because burn rate during a rough month is one of those numbers that turns a bad feeling into a very specific, very quantified bad feeling, and vague dread is somehow easier to carry than a precise one. Managers avoid a direct report's underperformance entirely, not the paperwork of a formal review, but the actual, human act of sitting across from someone and naming what isn't working. Every one of these is the same evasive move, wearing a different outfit. The dashboard doesn't get opened, the spreadsheet doesn't get pulled up, the conversation doesn't get scheduled, and in every case, the avoidance feels, in the moment, like a form of self-protection. It's worth noticing how this scales beyond any one manager too, because avoidance at the top of an organization doesn't stay contained there. If a founder stops opening the burn rate spreadsheet, that habit tends to trickle downward without anyone announcing it. Finance stops flagging concerning trends as urgently, because urgency from finance hasn't been rewarded with attention lately. Department heads stop bringing bad news upward in their own updates, because the last few times they did, it seemed to land without much follow-up. Within a few cycles, an entire organization can develop a kind of institutional incuriosity about its own weak spots, not because anyone decided that was the culture, but because the person at the top modeled not looking, and modeling is contagious in exactly the way people expect good habits to be contagious. Except this runs in reverse. A team generally checks what its leader checks, and just as reliably stops checking what its leader stops checking. That's the part worth sitting with for a second, because it's not irrational on its face. Avoidance genuinely does buy something. It buys emotional relief, real relief, right now, today. If you don't open the dashboard, you don't have to sit with the specific, sinking feeling of watching a number you're responsible for get worse. If you don't have the conversation with the underperforming employee, you don't have to feel the awkwardness of a difficult exchange, the risk of them getting defensive, the discomfort of delivering criticism to someone you otherwise like. Avoidance is, in the narrowest possible sense, working. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is make the next hour feel more bearable than it would otherwise. But that relief is borrowed, not earned, and it comes due with interest. The cost isn't emotional, it's practical, and it compounds the longer the avoidance continues, because problems caught early are almost always cheaper to fix than problems caught late. Think about what that actually means in a concrete situation. A shrinking customer base is a very different problem in month 1 than it is in month 6. In month 1, you might be looking at an early warning sign in a handful of accounts, maybe a support pattern, a usage dip, a competitor mention in a renewal call. Address it then, and you're having a handful of proactive conversations, maybe adjusting a feature roadmap, maybe having account managers reach out before anyone's actually decided to leave. By month 6, if nobody looked at the trend line for 5 straight months, you're not managing an early warning anymore. You're managing an exodus that's already picked up momentum, with contracts already lapsed, replacements already found, competitors already entrenched in accounts that used to be yours. The underlying problem might have been exactly the same problem the whole time. What changed is how much runway you had to fix it, and that runway shrinks every week the dashboard stays closed. The same math applies almost identically to a struggling employee. A team member who's missing targets in week 2 of a rough stretch is dealing with something that's probably still fixable with a conversation. Maybe they're unclear on priorities, maybe they're stuck on something they haven't asked for help with, maybe there's a personal situation eating into their focus that a manager could actually accommodate if they knew about it. Coaching at that stage is light. It's a 15-minute check-in, a clarified expectation, maybe a bit of extra support on one deliverable. Let that same situation run for a full quarter without anyone naming it, and everything about the intervention changes. The employee has now built up months of missed targets, which means the conversation isn't a light check-in anymore, it's a formal performance discussion with a paper trail. The employee themselves has had a full quarter to either quietly disengage, assuming nobody's noticed or nobody cares, or to grow anxious and defensive, assuming the axe is about to fall. Either way, the manager who avoided the early conversation because it felt uncomfortable now has to have a much harder one, later, with worse odds of a good outcome, and probably with HR sitting in the room. Notice that in both examples, the actual mechanism causing the damage isn't the bad news itself. Churn was always going to happen at some rate. Employees were always going to have rough stretches. The damage comes specifically from the gap between when the problem became visible and when someone actually looked at it, and that gap is entirely a function of the avoidance, not of the underlying business reality. 2 managers can face the exact same shrinking customer base. One checks weekly, regardless of mood, and catches it in week 3. The other checks only when things feel fine and doesn't look again until the number's impossible to ignore. Same market, same competitors, same starting problem. Wildly different outcomes, purely because of who kept looking. Here's the part that should really change how you think about this though, and it's not the part most people expect when they first hear about the Ostrich Effect. It's not that avoidance is common. Most managers, if they're honest, already suspect they do this somewhere in their job. The part that catches people off guard is that the avoidance itself is not a symptom sitting alongside the real problem. The avoidance is data. It's not just unhelpful while the real issue festers somewhere else. The act of avoiding is, itself, a signal pointing directly at what needs attention, and it's often a more reliable signal than the number you're avoiding, because you'd have to already know something was wrong at some level in order to feel the urge not to look. Think about what that actually implies. Nobody avoids a report that's guaranteed to look fine. You don't dread opening a dashboard when you're confident it's going to show good news. There's no emotional cost to checking something you expect to confirm. The dread only shows up when some part of you already suspects, even vaguely, even without being able to articulate it yet, that the news might not be good. So, the flinch the moment you catch yourself reaching for a different tab, finding a reason to check email first, telling yourself you'll look at it after lunch, that flinch has already done half the diagnostic work for you. It's telling you, before you've even seen the number, that some part of your own judgment has already flagged a problem worth looking at. Ignoring that flinch means ignoring information you generated yourself, for free, before any dashboard even loaded. This reframes the whole problem in a useful way. Most advice about facing bad news treats the difficulty as purely emotional. Be brave, have the hard conversation, don't be afraid of the numbers. That's true as far as it goes. but it puts the entire burden on willpower, on summoning courage in the moment, which is exactly the kind of solution that fails under pressure, because willpower is precisely the resource that's lowest when you're avoiding something in the first place. If bravery alone solved this, nobody would have an ostrich effect problem, because everybody already knows, in the abstract, that looking is better than not looking. Knowing that has never been the hard part. The hard part is that in the actual moment, with the actual dashboard one click away, the emotional cost of looking feels immediate, and the cost of not looking feels deferred and abstract. Every single time, the deferred cost loses that fight, because deferred costs always feel smaller than immediate ones, right up until the deferred cost arrives all at once. Which is why the practical fix has to be structural, not emotional. Because a structural fix doesn't require you to win the willpower fight in the moment at all. Build a fixed cadence for checking the numbers you'd rather avoid, weekly, monthly, whatever suits the metric, and treat that cadence as non-negotiable, regardless of mood, regardless of how the last check went, regardless of whether some part of you already suspects this week's number is going to sting. The entire point of a fixed cadence is that it removes the decision from the moment when you're least equipped to make it well. You're not asking yourself, "Do I feel like checking the dashboard today?" A question your avoidance instinct will happily answer for you every single time performance dips. You're just checking it on Tuesday, because it's Tuesday, the same way you'd check it if everything were going great. The schedule does the work that willpower can't reliably do. What that looks like in practice is fairly plain and deliberately unglamorous, because the whole point is that it shouldn't rely on anyone's mood or nerve on a given day. Put the churn review, the burn rate check, the pipeline walkthrough, the one-on-one with the employee who's been slipping, on the actual calendar, at a fixed recurring time, the same way you'd calendar a client call you can't reschedule. Treat it with the same seriousness you'd give an external commitment, precisely because there's no external party forcing you to show up for it the way a client would. The only enforcement mechanism is the one you build for yourself in advance, before the bad week arrives and gives you a reason not to. The critical discipline inside that cadence is refusing to let it become optional based on how good the news is likely to be. This is where a lot of well-intentioned systems quietly fail. A manager sets up a weekly review, sticks to it for a month while things are going fine, and then the first bad week arrives and suddenly there's a good reason to push the review to next week. Instead, a scheduling conflict, a busier than usual day, a feeling that there's nothing new to report anyway. That single skipped review is the ostrich effect reasserting itself, disguised as a scheduling issue. The cadence only has value if it survives contact with bad news, because bad news is precisely the condition it was built to protect against. A weekly review that only happens during good weeks isn't a system. It's just the avoidance pattern with a calendar invite attached to it. And this connects back to that earlier point about the flinch being useful data, because the two pieces work together as a genuinely practical management habit. The moment you notice yourself avoiding a specific report, or postponing a specific conversation, or finding a reason the numbers probably won't tell you anything new this week, treat that hesitation itself as the alert. Not a reason to wait until you feel more prepared. Not a sign that now's a bad time. The hesitation is the notification. It's telling you, more honestly than most dashboards ever could, that something in that specific area needs attention now, not later, precisely because some part of your own judgment has already started bracing for what it might find. It's worth being honest too that this fix doesn't remove the discomfort of bad news, and it was never meant to. The fixed cadence doesn't make a shrinking customer base feel good to look at, and it doesn't make a difficult conversation with an underperforming employee pleasant to have. What it changes is timing, not feeling. You still feel the sting of a bad number. You still feel the awkwardness of naming a problem to someone's face. The difference is that you feel it in month 1 instead of month 6, while the problem is still small enough that the discomfort is proportionate to something fixable, rather than delayed until the discomfort is proportionate to something that's already spiraled. Discomfort you can't avoid is still worth timing well, because the size of the problem you're facing when you finally look is not fixed. It's a direct function of how long you manage not to. None of this means obsessively monitoring every metric at all times, chasing every fluctuation, or turning every one-on-one into an interrogation. That's its own failure mode, and it burns people out just as effectively as avoidance does, just on a different timeline. The goal is narrower and more useful than constant vigilance. Notice where you're flinching, build a schedule that doesn't bend around bad weeks, and treat the discomfort of looking as cheap compared to the cost of looking late. A shrinking customer base caught in month 1 is a memo. Caught in month 6, it's a crisis. A struggling employee coached in week 2 is a quick conversation. Left until the quarter ends, it's a formal process with a much worse chance of a good outcome. The information was always available. The only variable that ever changed was whether someone was willing to look at it while it was still cheap to act on. Follow for more theories managers actually use.